Hello everyone, today we talk about Chinese sacred royalty, drawing some parallelisms with the European traditional meaning of the same. As you know, it's a topic that we have started investigating from last year, and just recently I made some videos about the Qingizid Yuan dynasty that somewhat fitting. We will keep talking about China, not so frequently, but especially as far as history of religions go, it's incredibly important to appreciate these Far Eastern Asian sources to give that properly complete Catholic dimension to traditional wisdom. It doesn't stop or doesn't even end, for that matter. In spite of time and distance, humanity doesn't work like watertight compartments. We have observed how, for example, it is entirely possible that the first king, everything under heaven, was actually founded by an Indo-European dynasty. And surely, throughout the centuries, contacts were always very intense between the two ends of Eurasia. Without mentioning that the actual traditional belief stresses, of course, the primal descendants of all humanity from a single source. And so you can appreciate, of course, how the Chinese would in fact consider their own country as basically the universe, and there is a similarly sort of universal limit boundary by approximation that you can appreciate in the fact that, I don't know, the Romans definitely in their own way had conquered the entire world. The great sort of basins of civilization tend to work partially like that, but of course it's primarily a metaphor. It's primarily a spiritual principle that in fact transcends the same physicality, the same space per se. So it's important to start in Chinese tradition from the most evident, the most fundamental principles of royalty. Because China definitely has a much stronger autocratic tradition for historical reasons that now I'm not referring to present times, really talking about, and we've seen it often in Schwerpunkt, the obvious sort of stratification, the fact that China was in a way much more contained, to a degree in fact more isolated than Europe, for example, that had a vast frontier. China had as well in the northwest, but the recipient of this immense demographic and agricultural basin was tended towards homogeneity, right? At the beginning of its history, like China was just more like a group of peoples that, however, tended to homogenize towards the Han ethnicity meant in a broader sense. And you know that the imperial institution is, regardless of the political fragmentation that periodically occurred in China, the center of it all. And unlike in Europe and the Mediterranean, where we had fundamentally different empires at different times, the Roman one definitely incarnating that ecumenic dimension was eventually not ever reached anymore. There is some parallelism definitely with Han China and the same fragmentation during the migration era. I make multiple videos about this. I actually, a couple of months ago, made a comparison between Rome, the Guptas, and the Hans, exactly for this purpose. But again, the Chinese compactness and the revolution around a single ruler is something much more sort of autocratically and rigidly, almost sclerotically imbued in their culture from millennia. Reason for which, of course, we have, fortunately, sources that describe to us the essence of this imperial grandeur. The first term that you've surely heard of is Tianzi, which is essentially an attribute of the sovereign, and it means son of heaven, right? And what does this mean? Because it's not entirely apparent. Of course, yes, it's the Son of God. There is a divine nature in there. But the original meaning, like if you want to be particularly accurate about the philosophical concept behind it, that is that the Tianzi is not born through ordinary means, right? There is in fact, a supernatural intervention that is not merely one of descendants, but also, as we will see it now, and we've seen it in other videos, such as the one titled Eternally Rising as the King of the Living, as a sort of Anachinos's sort of lack of rest that characterizes the greatest essence of a manifestation and actualization of imperial power. Essentially, it's as if the emperor had been a third force on his own that was characterized by this becoming, by this action, that is, as we'll see now, evidently connected to the fact that there is a fallen kind, right? This is a son of heaven, and of course there is the expectation of him sort of bringing all the kin back to heaven itself. But of course there is always a story of corruption and a cyclicity in this that the Chinese Empire used juridically to legitimize the substitution of the various dynasties throughout Chinese history, regardless of the broader Catholic linear view of, say, where was this going. We will have to take a look at the traditional doctrine of the ages, of the eras, because that would also show in this context, like the awareness of that. The philosophy stemming from that legitimization, like of the current ruler, definitely is one of the most straightforward, sources, like, of the idea that right is might. Right, never make this confusion. Apparently, conservatives still make, mostly for populistic reasons, because basically they want to give the impression that power is just something you can abuse of, right, and not something that you immediately lose, as we will see. And it is also notorious, if you read Xenophon, for example, about the Iranian tradition, as soon as it's misused, right? Otherwise, there literally wouldn't be the substitution. It would be some sort of black hole, as well as everything reaches critical mass and does not implode or re-explode, whatever it would be supposed to happen, but would essentially cancel any other sort of life. In tradition, actually, it's the other way around, right? This is an all-encompassing power that subsumes all the one that escaped from the fall, from the single unity, and the actual threat to the universe is the lack of power, is the generation of the force, the exhaustion of the energy, and the thermic death that we observe also, in fact, in physics, that is quite spot on as far as the intended in that sort of more materialistic sense, ignoring the idea that energy can be created instead according to tradition, which also would explain the origin of the universe and else. But this is a field that now we're not even daring to sort of enter. But it's of course incredibly interesting given this premise. We will see now why right is might is right. We have explained it for that matter also in other videos, but if you're unsure of that, just that you may have essentially missed the single most fundamental point in tradition, which is not a very good indicator, to say the least. And just being nice today, I feel inclined towards that. So the Tianzi, Son of Heaven, incarnates the heavenly mandate, the Tianming, right? So this evangelic mission of universal authority that in fact is present exactly also in Christology, right, and in any other traditional belief. This also suggests, of course, the presence of a genuine supernatural force. In other words, it's not a scam. It's not a fallen system that convinces people that the ruler is some sort of omnipowerful guy, just because if you want, humanity still exists, and that is technically not possible in that process. This is not to say don't distrust authority just because it's not the divine standard. Realize that if there is power there, it's for a reason, right? And if you are not in the place of authority, whatever authority does wrong, just know that you do worse by definition, morally, personally, existentially. So you're not really in the condition, in fact, of being as powerful as that. Now, as Lao Tzu articulates, this force that the Tianzi owns in the form of the Tianming is characterized by another principle known as the wei-wuwei. Now, there is a controversy about this. This term is an essential tenet of Taoism, right? And it's understood of when to take action and when to refrain from it, right? Which is actually a corruption in the more, say, popular vulgata of the actual meaning. You have here the term wu, which translates to not having, while bei means action. And so you see, it's like the yin and the yang, right? It's the opposite of one another. It's the contrast between one another. But the correct interpretation is not the, aside from the fact of how you can translate this without action, or more precisely non-action properly, it's not the fact that simply, as some people say, is you have to be balanced. This speaks of the harmony of nature and it follows its course. No, it has absolutely nothing to do with that, right? The wu-wei is to achieve a harmonious balance with the Tao, so and by extension the universe, but intended of course as this immanent divine power that allows you to, in fact, as we'll see now, act and actualize yourself. But the wu-wei, of course, has to do with the concept of action without action, or at least of effortless action, which is also like the entire concept of wisdom, right? So it's connected with vision, and like in the eye of Ra, essentially the molding of the world through your own sheer will. In scholastics in the West, we had essentially the unmoved mover that we, of course, inherited philosophically from Aristotle in a strictly literary sense, but this, of course, was at the base of every, awareness of power manifestation. Say, I don't know, and Augustus knew perfectly what we were talking about, given that he had managed to, say, also without being much of a warrior himself, through his best auspices, literally as he writes in the Res Gestae, recompacted, and also, of course, thanks to we will see now, the power of Fortuna that had been healingly handled by Caesar, so to handle Octavian, what would eventually make him Augustus, and so from Augur, from Sebastus in this elevation, in fact, a mere order stemming from will, right? So the wei-wuwei actually represents an immaterial influence achieved through pure presence, essentially through the absolute self-actualization, pure virtue, right? That allows essentially the divine recomposition of the universe into one. And in the Chinese tradition, this manifests through heavenly qualities such as winning without fighting, being obeyed without commanding, attracting without calling, and acting without overt action, right? Naturally, and this is understood even those, of course, know the Gospels, such force is invisible, right? And even more, it's sort of covert. This is meant to essentially explain how the immanence of divine power in nature and the capacity of the alignment through the energies that are unlocked in the universe through a merely spiritual inner capacity, or at least one that becomes the preconception for the actual remolding of the universe itself, right? And albeit this force is invisible, like the wind, there are beautiful metaphors in this Chinese literature, its impact is as inevitable as the same immanence of such energies in the universe. What does it mean? Of course, that there is an eschatological belief in it. Say the way we don't know whether humanity will be saved or not, right? But what has to happen has already been decided in the measure in which this sheer will to power will arbitrarily act upon the divine standard, right? As Confucius constantly observes, ordinary individuals simply yield to such force, much like blades of grass bow to the wind. For the sovereign embodies virtue, he says. This is incredibly important. This is something that probably in this time in history, in this context of political debate, worldwide, if people understood and accepted, of course they can't, because fourth estaters are completely and hysterically paranoid to any kind of acknowledgement of such a thing. Of course, he who rules always does so with the decisive moral majority of the people. The Chinese emphasize the fact that, of course, very, say, monarchocentrically, that, of course, their emperor is the one that actually moves the people accordingly. In the, say, at least in Europe, there is more nuanced sort of shade of this and pattern for which it's both. It's happening from both sides. And this is definitely true, because it's as if the souls of the ruler and one of the subjects, in the moment in which they will succeed in action, are in harmony, right? They are in symphony to a degree that really manages the world to be molded by such spiritual force, with concord, right? And therefore, nothing, again, that is wrong can actually succeed, right? And everything that, of course, succeeds to a degree owns a degree of right, right? And this obviously sort of, leaving aside the fact that there is half of the West obsessed with the concept of tyranny, which is just an alibi for lesser people to pretend that they have inherent actual value, aside from the potential one that it is metaphysically there, which are two radically and extremely different things. The fact that you have a divine potential within you has literally nothing to do with any trace of human worth in your simple existence, unless you actually do something about it, and you exist in some way that actually causes a positive outcome of some sort. And in this regard, Confucius basically tells us something very realistic, that is to say, power derives from essentially the behavior of people. If people are fundamentally less virtuous than the rulers, they will follow them. And there is a difference in quality, in merit, right? If you, as Confucius says, bend, bow like grass to the wind, you are essentially letting that happen. And the reason why this can happen is actually not an absolutely positive one, meaning that evidently the ruler you bow to is more powerful than you because he has earned that much. But if you simply bow to that, which you still decide to do, because if you say, only if you were dead, you would actually not contribute at all, but at that point you would also be a loss of life for the greater purpose that rulers actually have to bring all life and to rejuvenate it and to spread it in the universe in an orderly manner. Which is that you're still in life, of course, imperfect, to a degree that, however, can, through such harmony, be cultivated to achieve more. This is how powers grow, by the way, throughout history. Because if you think about it, if it were just about essentially a degeneration of the divinity, there wouldn't be any sort of increase in power, or this power would be sort of taken from somewhere and not really used to, say, increase this say, the actual actualization of the self on earth. Instead, the sense is that there is some positive done that allows life not just to perpetuate itself, but also to grow stronger and break through. And naturally, this is a struggle with the same universe, because of course, if you reason in a classically physical way, you would essentially still separate this sort of spooky, ghostly force I'm talking about from actual matter that would be some sort of thing that stays there for no reason. Instead, in tradition, of course, matter is also a product of the fall of absolute life, right? And this gets essentially transfigured too in the divine accomplishment. Now, the text Zongyong, that is the Doctrine of the Mean, the fourth book of the Confucian canon, states in 23:6 that the sacred works of heaven possess the highest degree of immateriality. All right. Now, this other concept is incredibly interesting because it basically leads to a pathway where you realize that heaven doesn't quite intervene. Like we've seen in the Doctrine of the Two Natures that there are two dimensions. And one, the heavenly, the superior, the incorruptible one, is perennially present, right? It's just not in the same condition that the other nature really is. And so what really happens in the relation between heaven and the ruler, that is the medium with the rest of this fallen world, is merely an effort of the ruler to come back to the one carrying together the entire universe, if successful. So the highest degree of immateriality here does not leave room for any sort of kind of dualistic heresy like Gnosticism that have literally nothing to do with tradition. It's sort of shocking how people approach tradition somewhat believe that Gnosticism has anything to do with it. This is the religion of lesser people. Only populists believe in Gnosticism throughout all history, that there is no other evidence otherwise, and of course it doesn't work, also because it's all based on suicide at the end of the day. And of course, in fact, the simple Gnostic Cartesian separation between matter and spirit that contemplate two literal forces, two literal poles. In tradition, there is no such thing like two different poles, right? There is only one, right? And then you have a corruption from the same that has the possibility of either coming back or continuously degenerating towards the below, right? There is no salvation below. There is no magic coming back to the one if you mortify yourself, if you destroy your body, or if you think that matter is some sort of evil creation that keeps you down. It's your own fault for what you are, right? Deal with that. That's the single most important thing you can do with a human being, as a human being, not blaming others for that. That is exactly in traditional doctrine, depending on an external force other than yourself that makes you fail in self-actualization, and that will never exhaust your thirst of spirituality ever, because it's simply something you can get so much externally of you, then it will end, and you will still be ever more dependent and corrupted and degenerated in the process. And the Zongyong gives us other metaphors of this. The work of heaven that has no sound or odor, right, is as subtle as the lightest feather, right? So there is here, in the sort of imitation of heaven that the ruler must achieve, of course, that subtlety, that discretion, right? That modesty. Think about Roman modesty in the mores, right? What is that also true? The Augustan propaganda was stressed, right, for being recovered and reapplied. It is exactly this balance. It's not the excess, it's not the dependence on luxury, on materiality, but coming back to a level of moral reformation, a new age of the spirit, in other words. Now, expounding on the concept of acting without acting, the wei-wuwei, another passage declares, this is the same Zongyong, but 26 to 5 to 6 and 31:1, that the supremely perfect man, due to the vastness and depth of their virtue, this is in Latin the magnanimitas, which we translate banally as magnanimity, as some sort of, generosity, but sort of more nobler way. No, this is what it actually meant in our language. It is the greatness, the power, the immensity of the spirit, right, are akin to the earth. In other words, basically, this spirit is so great in these men that it encompasses, in fact, the entire kin in this, everything under heaven in this case. In terms of height, the text continues, and brilliance, they resemble the sky, right? Of course, the source of light, the Apollonian ideal. And regarding expansiveness and continuity, they parallel limitless space and time, right? So their being is beyond limitation of any kind, right? Also of time and space, which means that you can be truly and metaphysically and physically at the same time somewhere else, right? He who achieves this sublime perfection remains concealed. They don't need to show off, right? Because that is a sin, just per se. And yet, like the earth, they reveal themselves through their benefits. They appear still, yet like the sky, they initiate countless transformations. So, these people, through their sheer will to power, are able to move the world, the unmoved mover, right? They seem inactive, yet like the very fabric of space and time themselves, they bring forth their creations to fruition. It's as if their mere existence, again, conditioned the world to a scale that the average person can't really see. This is the problem. You see, even say climatic phenomena as some sort of, and how they affect the world, right? Just to make an example here, there are lots of sort of environmental metaphors, right? And the idea being that if something happens anywhere to anyone, this is part of a broader logos that has wanted this to happen, but that, of course, just like in the theory of games, may have literally been triggered by just a very small and not even just physical act, right? There is a spiritual power at work that you do not see, but that is inherent at any of us in potential and can expand like a seed to cover the entire world, to really rule the entire universe, right? It's as if, again, time and space bend on such force and obeyed it. And so, according to the Zongyong, only such individuals are deemed worthy of sovereign authority and power to command others, at least in theory. Here, of course, the standard that is described is absolute. So this is obviously a metaphor for God. But again, pictorially, we are given essentially what the faculties of power resemble like. And so whether even by some shorter extent these manifest, well, they have exactly this characteristic. And the interesting aspect is that if you liminally understand what this means, is that what God does, you literally can't see if you're at least at a lower form of being. At least you should be dead completely, you should be gone not to understand it. But this is exactly what sort of calls the soul towards the truth, towards eternity, towards the absolute, right? In other words, God's ways are mysterious, but as far as we are from Him, we still, as we've seen, partly divine beings, get a glimpse of that, right? Realize that some of this force is at work and that through spiritual refinement, not only we can understand it to a greater extent, but in harmony with that, this will resonate with us in such, in fact, a perfect way that will give us the same participation into it. After all, as we said before, we all have power. We can all do something. We can all be successful at something. Just for existing, for living, we are, right? So this power is literally in our hands, is literally in our power of creation and to life, right? And this is banalized modernistically, secularistically, by saying, okay, well, this is just, how we are. There's nothing special about that. Instead, this was seen traditionally in every single culture as the gateway to a higher dimension, if properly cultivated. Now, established in such strength or virtue, the sovereign or Vang, which means king, and that, by the way, in its graphemic fixation, is really symbolized as this line between the highest and the lowest, in ancient China, held a pivotal role as a medium between heaven and earth, right? But again, this we are already familiar with. Now we will precise further the idea of the continuous rising, just like the sun, right? Cyclically in the world, from which the world derives its spiritual, other than also physical nurturing, right? And what the role of the sovereign is in this, differently from God, right? He must continuously operate, right? He is not in the highest sphere of nature, right? It's something else. It's actually a sort of third condition itself. Now, it was believed in ancient China that the fortunes or misfortunes of the empire, of literally the ruler's policy, along with the moral character of his people, were intrinsically linked to his own conduct. As we said before, here the Chinese saw it a bit more like, again, all depends on this bigger guy, because again, China was basically that. This incredibly hierarchical system with the overwhelming majority of the population sort of subjected to that in a centralistic way. But the idea, of course, is that his power, and it could have not been otherwise, would derive from the consonance with the subject's spirit. They would thus obey to him and making him ever more powerful in that regard, right? And this because the spiritual dimension sort of resonated within itself. So as an enormous pneuma encompassing all the living, right? And beyond, actually, to some extent, that was vibrating in the direction of God and wanting to, in fact, reach it, annihilating to that. And the Chinese saw the, let's say, the notion of virtue associated with the essence of the sovereign rather than his actions, which ultimately determined whether the behavior of his subjects was virtuous or not. So much they considered the authority of the emperor, and how directly they highlighted how, essentially, to say it very brutally, every people gets the ruler that they deserve, right? And it's true, right? The most, like, every single people has the ruler that they deserve. There is not such a thing like, but if I'm against the guy in charge, you're gnostically separated from others and saved in a puritanic, hypocrisy. No, because you're under that guy. You're doing nothing to overthrow the system. Or even if you're doing it, it's not enough, evidently, right? So if, say, this is with the right and the left, if they suck, right, it can be in some merit of value in the difference between them, but if at large, if that is half of the society sucks, it's because the other half essentially sucks itself, right? And there's no way around it, right? Which is instead what you realize foretestators today have become almost phobical. You see all these brainwashed morons on the internet that think that there is either a conspiracy theory that is sort of imposing them something, as if Satan himself ruled over them, but they magically had still the best quality of life in the world, and the rest of the world sucked much worse than, in fact, they don't want to recognize, making up fictional fantasy realities that do not exist even by any minimal stretch of the imagination. Or there is this sort of everything's fine. After all, really nothing is wrong, right? There is no intrinsic right or wrong. We should just sort of understand each other. We should share our experiences. We should be tolerant. We should listen to it. And then until someone will actually smash their head in the streets to rob them or rape them. And this is actually the point, that in order to be virtuous, you don't have to be any of the two. If you're any of the two, you're fucked up already. And there is hardly anything, especially if you're an adult person, you can do about that. But the idea is that there is, in theory, at least always, a redeeming capacity in potential that you must actualize if you want to have anything back out of it. And you will. If you succeed, you will. That is in between this. And that manages to see through the world, encompassing it, and in fact making order, right? And this is a great challenge, because also from the intellectual point of view, the idea is that you have all this other people. There is yet this other people that are the supposed elite, the supposed intelligentsia, at least, of because elite in foretestator language is too common. It's the guys who own the big corporations, they're all Marxists or whatever. Here I'm talking about the elite of the supposed intelligentsia, the actual, say, upper middle class that is supposed to be the backbone of that sort of egalitarian standards that should balance things out. You may have even the best insights, say, compared, right, in relative terms to the rest of the people, but if you're not able to be vocal about it, to get out there, and to actually sound convincing, you're really failing yourself at it. So people who have power are actually doing better than you. Naturally, you could question where's the limit of power? There's always a collective and individual dimension that overlap, right? Everybody essentially is responsible for everybody in tradition. But it's also true that, in fact, most of this enormous power people claim that this sort of elite has is actually not that much of an enormous power. I mean, it is, because as we know traditionally, people accept this, right? And not accept it passively to be destroyed, to be skinned alive. No, they accept to be exploited as far as, however, from where they come from, it's better than what they were. And so this generates other force, and nothing stays the same. There is no such thing like a system that manages to control the same. Actually, those who try to do that because they see more, totalitarian, dictatorial, are the weakest ones, because in there, actually, people are the lesser of the lesser, and they do not have moral force. And so, yes, the regime exists because of the size of moral force of the people, but that's the lesser people with a disgustingly low force, and surprise, surprise, the regimes collapse. And so when you look at the West or any other sort of big system, and you simply say, oh my God, this is evil, or this. But yes, it's just you being a paranoid foretestator. The system goes without you. Deal with that, all right? And if you can't see what power is, that's exactly what you deserve. In any case, referring to the perfect or transcendent individuals, the same Zongyong, this time 22.1 and 23.1, states that such beings are capable of aiding in the transformations of heaven and earth, thereby nurturing others to reach their full potential. This is what we're saying for. That's the purpose of civilization. Other commonly held view: I'm a paranoid, complex, unaccomplished person who lives in the limit of the world, maintained still by welfare state, but thinking that living out in the wilderness in a hut makes me free and pure. No, you're just a deranged, paranoid failure that will disappear from the face of the earth without accomplishing anything. You're not free, right? Freedom does not belong to people, it belongs to God. You must have at best liberty, in the sense that since you are not God, and since you are sinful, and since you are an accomplishment, and you're a failure in some sense, even if you were the single most successful person on earth currently, there is no God here. You have something to learn from others, right? And you should be rigidly and enforcedly schooled into understanding what that actually means, right? Before, these people were simply carried to the front. They were the useful idiots for cannon fodder. They can, at some point, come back to be that, and that was actually a way to give them some balls of kind. Today, of course, it's different, but the idea is that civilization is not there, again, the monster that is only the one in your head because you cannot afford the power to handle it. Civilization is exactly the opportunity for, of course, also shipwrecking to a degree and sort of damaging to a degree, but evenly, like offering an enormous opportunity, even in fixing it, even in taking it over, even in being in control, at aggrandizing your own self, right? In enormously accomplishing yourself and rising to a level of power that derives from your enhanced vision of the universe through the exercise of such power handling, right? This is why rulers in this traditional doctrine embody a third separated power alongside heaven and earth. What I just said, again, nothing to do with Gnosticism. Heaven is another dimension. Earth is the realm of the falling that still have some power to, in theory, come back up. There's not like Earth, like there's a pull of darkness that is equally powerful to the dimension of the perennial, right? You are distinguished as a ruler from the rest of the people because you're the one who has gotten the mean to invert the fall, right? Civilizationally speaking, and you have the leadership capacity to recompact people's will into one great force. This central role requires the sovereign to cultivate an inner state of triumphal existence. That is in becoming. We've seen it in the video about the Sol Invictus and the Roman triumph, for example. The idea of this path in the sacred city with the face painted red, which of course equates to the sun, right? That has to perform the cycle. And triumph after triumph, right? Day after day, the sun rises again, and every solstice after the coming back of depending on where you are on Earth, while daylight has been fading, at some point, sun comes back, right? This is actually what the ruler really does. It's an eternal rejuvenation, eternal improvement, an eternal constance in springing out once again, expanding yourself, exhausting yourself, but then reacquiring a greater force, right? And this cycle is known in the phrase, according to this Chinese tradition, the immutability in the middle, right? This phrase encapsulates the principle that in the immutability of the middle, the virtue of heaven is manifested. A phrase coming from the Lunio-Confucius Dialogues 627, the state immutability in the middle constitutes virtue. Few men remain there. You realize that Aristotle's ethics actually tells the same thing, right? There is something in the middle that can be considered not simply a balance between forces in a mundane, say, human, sort of abstractly sort of vices and virtues thing. No, it's literally being at the center of the universe and managing to balance it single-handedly, just like a Schwerpunkt, right? And the statement there, few men remain there, right, is the actual reality of politics, right? How many men actually manage to succeed in maintaining the greater power, right? The greater the power, the greater the effort, the greater the virtue, of course, but the rarer and the more exhausting that is, right? So actually, it's meant to be an eternal challenge, right? In order for rulers to be truly God, they would have to reduce everything to perfection, to the one. So as far as humanity exists as such, so with this fallen sin, it can't happen, right? Still, the sin of the people is the sin of the rulers, in a way or another, and vice versa. Simply because had this idea been realized, nothing could have disrupted the harmonious flow of human affairs in the state. And so, yes, it's a divine, heavenly metaphor. The Chinese distinctly differentiated between the imperial function and the individual identity of the emperor. This is very relatable at different times in its history. In other words, the office is divine. This is not much, actually, a mark of archaic, say, originality. It actually shows already a very modern and secularized understanding of the office as a sort of hypothesis. Yes, it is true, as we've seen, according to the doctrine of the two natures, the emperor should have this aspirational model in the absolute hypothesis. The point, though, is that this is in a realm that is so sort of even cognitively separated from the human condition that what actually matters as far as the earthly institutions are concerned is not much the institution per se, but who actually officiates it. Right? This is incredibly important. The institution in itself is something that sediments over time, right? But also in the rituals, like there wasn't quite just as we think politheism that didn't even really exist, if we want to be precise, as if, I just make a material sacrifice. And so this is essentially a superstition, right? The god, so you're basically depending on somebody else, just making for gifting him with something, that hoping to get something back. While there is this almost negotiational, in fact, a struggle in between, which is what should substantiate the entire, let's say, effort of the monarch, and not quite in a do-this, right? But in something more, I will do as much, even though I'm limited, and I will try to surpass myself as far as that. That's the moment in which things should improve. But it's actually, in fact, the purity of the performer that makes the ritual powerful, that will actually bring that, to maintain the order, or even to improve it accordingly. The hypothesis of, say, the office in the West is something that comes pretty late in time. I mean, you can argue that it sort of always existed. You can think that already by the Common Era, exactly because of the necessity of Christ, all these so-called, it's a terrible word, a pagan word, but we're actually talking about the Catholic one, the actual word before Christ actually was, as far as properly the heavenly rulers were concerned, had stopped believing, especially because of the common people, in fact, that are always the problem, by qualitative standard, that anyone could be that God, right? And so when you say, this is not about blaming one another simply per se, but as we've seen, the product of the people is the ruler. And so if that idea has already been fundamentally lost, you can just find some traces of that. Gradually, what this will turn into is a increasing hypostatization of the of the same God, but also of the manifest power on earth through, in fact, an institution that, however, will be empty per se. Unless, in fact, if any institution works, there is somebody who is able to make it work. There's no such thing like a perfect constitution or system, or everything changes, first of all. But the most important thing is what people officiate that, and what kind of virtue exists in them. That is what truly matters, right? So that before this hypostatization, which in China was so advanced because of, in fact, the elevation of also this earthly standard of the ruler to something incredibly distant from the people, as instead a sort of numen. I mean, we will look at this in also the traditional meaning of the numen is incredibly important. It's as if, I don't know, an Augustus had simply materialized in his presence with his genius that immanent force of the universe that, in this sense, did not need an institution per se, right? Augustus formally didn't really change anything among the Roman institutions, for example. The empire already existed. He just cumulated prerogatives as if, he was a magnet that attracted them because of his capacity in handling them. But it was his mere presence that made him divine. And what is fascinating in this, not just because this is the fulfilling of the prophecy recorded by traditional peoples of the appearance of another golden era between the bronze and the iron one, and of course is Augustan reign as also Christ's birth, in fact being providentially in the same time. Like we do know from the same Romans that were, as you know, in their what we improperly call their republican sort of oligarchic system, incredibly distrustful towards the monarchy that de facto the empire was transforming itself to, that, and still enemies of these figures orientatively for this reason, that recognized divinity and in them, right? Different authors say this about Caesar, about Augustus. The same Cicero actually says that, right? And he wasn't like for Caesar in that sense, but he realized it was something quasi-divine in him. And please listen to the Fortuna Caesaris and what that entire deal really meant for those people, how they saw the world, and how we basically haven't even told this that is written literally in the sources that the single most important people in the history of mankind that everybody studied from every perspective, they literally say this and nobody literally even cares. What did they mean, right? And this is what we see in the light of tradition, right? If you read Kantorovic's The King's Two Bodies, you will realize how in 15th century England, France, there had been that sort of hypostatization of the office, the idea that there was the idea that the king never dies, really. And not just because he is, as we'll see now, somebody that is able to win over death, but because there is literally a crown, an office that never disappears. And even when a king is dead, the continuity of the monarchy goes on. And for this, there are two actual bodies. One is a wax figure, and then is the actual corpse of the past. And as you know, when the French king was finally laid down in the grave, the banner of France went down for a moment, saying the king is dead, and then rising once again, long live the king. And you understand here in the Chinese tradition how actually crystallized the system already was. So yes, there is all this wisdom, there are all these sort of acknowledgments and reflections on the imperial authority, but it's also something very different from Europe that might have seemed something more barbarian to an extent, but actually contained that greater egalitarian system, even in some of the most, as we've seen, oligarchic but not monarchic systems out there. Rome, right, that in comparison, like, again, incredibly closer to the spring, right, of Indo-European, in fact, concept of regality than China could ever been by that point. Is incredibly important, and that also tells you why Rome achieved what she achieved beyond what China did. You understand why in China thus the office is divine. The emperor holds this role as he's elevated and sanctified by the say. And so this, of course, mirrors to some degree that the path to it, the education had to be accomplished. So it all went together with the actual status, the actual power and prestige that it really had. So you can't cross this out of the equation. If such great power existed, it is because the people were superior, right? It's just like civilization. If you are scared of civilization being corrupted, it's because you know that you can get corrupted. You shouldn't be scared of embrace that if you are actually able not to be, right? That is on you, and that's the single most important thing that matters. Otherwise, everybody would either corrupt or do nothing and die. Power does manifest exactly in that fray. Now, upon ascending to the throne, the Chinese emperor relinquished his personal name. He adopted an imperial title. This is similar, to some extent at least, to think about the Roman cognomina, or also some adoptions by higher figures, right? In the case, of course, of Caesar being Octavian's adopted father, and it was meant like a literal father, because that spiritual power was considered to be superior to establish that bond. And so the Chinese case, this was of his own choosing, or it was assigned to him. This is something we should see more in a historical video, rather. But the most important thing is that he was not perceived merely as an individual, but as an embodiment of one of nature's great forces, akin to the sun, or the North Star itself, to orient all his people. Thus, misfortune, or popular revolt, is interpreted as evidence that the emperor has betrayed the principle. The doctrine of the true natures tells us that, of course, the principle remains intact. But again, it's in another dimension, right? And as far as the earthly rulers must do, they're conditional, but separated from the rest of the people, must still align to the higher nature, and not this being simply detained, right? It serves as a sign from heaven regarding the sovereign's decline, not in his capacity as a ruler as such, but as a person. So you understand that, yes, there had been, of course, like a hypostatization of this office, but this was always referred to, of course, a supernatural dimension of the higher nature, right? And in this sense, traditionally, as obviously, it was only the person's fault if anything crumbled, right? But this fault was also shared by the people for having let that happen, for having produced such ruler, in our words. So remember that this obsession with tyranny is a Gnostic heresy, right? You can fight against tyranny when this conventionally sounds like that, and that's the moment in which the system crumbles. But being ruled by a tyrant in the first place it's not a compliment about you, right? You are responsible for it. You do not belong to a normal people, country, culture. Now, more broadly, the idea that the king or chief's primary and essential role is to perform the ritual and sacrificial acts that serve as the central focus of life in traditional societies is, of course, a concept found across a wide range of civilization. We will talk about the rite more in depth in other videos, but what is important here is how it connects to the ruler, right? Just yesterday we were talking about Pizarro's quest for the Inca Empire, and we find, of course, in pre-Columbian Peru, for example, such royal investment. We've seen how he is a reflection of Inti, the sun, and the Inca himself. That means that the Imperial, the ruler, Imperial Ordner. We've seen this today with China. We've seen it in the Hellenic polis. We've seen it in ancient Rome. And this concept reinforces, obviously, the previously mentioned inseparability of royal dignity from the priestly or pontifical role. Not everybody could access to the rite, to the temples, to the sacred spaces, right? If this happened, of course, it was because the community as a whole allowed it to some degree. Think about, I don't know, in the Norse world, right? In the pre-Christian era, and partly also beyond, this would transform just itself in some way. The priests controlled who could, for example, grab new land out there, just even in a colonization sort of Viking expansion kind. And so the for example, settlement of a new community had to be sanctioned in a way by the community in mutual agreement with the ruler, so that these would not overstep to essentially unbalance the system and making it collapse, damage, for example, the liberty of the people. But at the same time, this could go in the other way, right? This could prevent greater power to emerge, which is actually and exactly what happened during the Viking era, right? That's also why eventually Christianity and feudalism and everything were adopted by elites, because these had actually achieved power, going far beyond, breaking the boundaries that had been previously set by the community, but they had achieved that power. And so they were rightfully leading their people to a higher stage of civilization with benefits for everybody involved, right? At least in that collective sense, regardless of the differences that always happen according to traditional doctrine of the cases, because of the literally different value that people have. If you're still alive and complain about tyranny, why aren't you out there fighting against it and losing your life, risking to do so in the process? How's that? Right? It's just look at totalitarian regimes. Oh, they were just fighting because otherwise they would have been, sent to gulags or, concentration camps. Really? These people were accomplices, right? At every level, just because they were still there, breathing, right? This is how life works. And even if you say, well, okay, but would you do that? But I'm fallen. Big reveal, Schwerpunkt is fallen, but you may never know. The beauty of Transcendence is that these accomplishments can redeem many things in the first place, but the meaning is there is that still, this doesn't change that those people weren't, as powerful. They were actually agreed, they were allowing that government to exist in the first place, and blaming it on other people, saying, but you didn't, would you do it? Those people did it. That's how far it went. And that's why they collapsed, why they disastered. Right? Being a lesser person is not an excuse for being a lesser person. There is nothing normal in being a human being. Aristotle, in his Politeia 6.5.2 and sooner to 3.9, states kings possess this dignity of royalty, because they are priests of the common cult, right? In other words, Aristotle identifies in the reason why kings are endowed with these powers the fact that the undissolvable mutual dependency of such force, the ruler and the people, right? There can't be a ruler if the people are not the identical reflection of it, and vice versa, right? And this, of course, sort of declinates itself in all the differences in political systems that can occur, right? Here we're talking about rulers as power detainers. Aristotle talks about, say, the monarchy, and then he talks about tyranny, etc. So it's different in categorically. But if you look at history, as we often do, and you wonder why, let's say, a system was like this rather than another, you can simply say, okay, well, this just happened for some strange reason, or I don't care because I don't know, I want to focus on another thing. That power actually exists in the world because of the one that exists where you're focusing on, right? You can't have Rome if you hadn't had China, and vice versa, in the ways they were, right? It's a collective, fatal reality of why this exists, and even more painful, like the degree of fragmentation of political power. You have people who are proud to engage in national. What's proud of engaging in a tradition that is not Catholic, that does not aim at world domination, right? You can do it, of course, through a nation, right? But at the same time, who has succeeded so far, if not some ancient nations and probably ethnicities that took over Catholic empires that have not been replicated in relative terms and are insisting, in fact, on their own sort of separatistically isolationistic self-obsession and referentiality, right? There is nothing to be proud of being the average person of any country, because the average is a load of garbage also just by the standards you can have in those countries. The average person is not well located in any community that you pick, right? Even if it's only one person, just for the fact that it's a human being in relation with God, there's something very sinister about that. Because you're human only because of the incarnation of your sin, your willful sin, not somebody placing it on you. Again, as, of course, Gnostics will try to attract lesser people into their superstitious cult of dualism. That, of course, is aimed at the responsibilizing the individual, because that's the only attraction you can find. That's actually how you allow the individual to destroy himself faster. But you have like great examples of this systems in ancient history. For example, Sparta witnessed the foremost duty of her kings being in conducting sacrifices, and this was similarly true for the early sovereign kings of Rome, as we very well know, given that they were holding the office of and the function of Pontifex Maximus. It was eventually split, right? This was all into, like, all the magistracies, right, were into the hands of the king. And eventually, these offices, they are deemed to be divine as such, and so the res publica that sort of is defined by them, of course, passed in the hands of the worthier of the system as they seem. Like Romulus, of course, was the gold standard. Then the kings corrupted, people corrupted, and so they couldn't have just one single leader, right, that would also lead them anywhere successfully, right? But Rome, as you understand, as we were just saying, like, the variety of political systems still achieved world domination and the transfiguration of mankind, also through a non-royal system. This is incredibly important because no other system ever accomplished what Rome did, metaphysically, in the centrality of the cosmos. So this is, and we'll talk way more about that, also from a spatial point of view, why Rome is the center of the universe. And denying this means to deny God itself as a definition by human standards. But of course, most people don't even know what this even supposed to mean. And of course, like the same emperors of Rome would actually detain by convention the office of Pontifex Maximus. That was to officiate the highest sacred rites, right? This is seen often as, oh well, but it was very powerful and had a greatest senate. The typical materialistic, structuralistic diversion from the point. It was the single most important office because it was the single most direct medium with God. And the empire could have not existed in the first place without this perennial connection and this continuous struggle of the ruler with the divinity. There are some great examples in Roman history that show how this was necessary for the manifestation of the Imperium. Publius Cornelius Scipio, Africanus to be later, would in fact become so because of a, say, literal monastic ascetic experience that the sources talk about in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. In a way that is not very different from what the Templars would do in their monasteries before getting to the fray of battle and that utter carnage and bath of blood. So let's be extremely serious about this. If you haven't spotted this connection in history, there is something severely wrong in your political, historical, and cultural education. Right? The king possessed a transcendent power drawn from this modern living. The idea is that life as we know it from in our human nature is nothing compared to the one in the higher nature. That's an eternal life. And this is also the entire point. Like the struggle of mankind is the one to save everyone collectively, the ones that we love, the ones that we want to live forever with. And as such, the king naturally emerged as the one best suited to enact the authority of the rites and bridge the earthly realm with the divine. Hence, Pontifex, he who builds bridges. You have been told, oh yes, because these were magistrates, or at least these higher priests that supervised the construction of actual bridges. Have you ever thought that the bridge, it's Jungian archetypal meaning, etc. It's literally the fact that these people bridged the entire world that Rome had united under a single rule with God. Consequently, in traditions that feature distinct priestly estate, the ruler inherently belongs to this one, right? By virtue of his original dignity and function, often serving as its leader. This is very interesting because, as we will see in the end, there is a split, of course, in the history of mankind that occurs in, especially like in the Christian world, but not only, where the institution of the empire and the one of the church are separated. And this also will be extremely effective in the history of civilization. As a matter of fact, more than any other afterwards. So this is just like the example of Rome. There is evidently a degeneration from the age of heroes, right? Of the Bronze Age and the older, the Silver Age, more the Golden one. But there is a capacity to spend this force, right? Then eventually there's a difficulty in keeping it together, right? And this is typically human, right? And it speaks of the corruption of power itself. But the capacity of civilizationally organized communities through the sum of forces that can't be held individually anymore, but can be still joined by different people is really a thing, right? That's why it's a democracy, in my opinion, does not exist. It's a bad word, and it's not bad the system that we call as democracy in conventional reality, because it shows this, that yes, you can elevate people to a degree that is still sort of horrifying, but as a whole, as a mass of people, it still can function and achieve great results. And this depends because this specific people that you're using historically, ethnically, say culturally, is inherently capable of doing so. Remember that it's not the institution, it's not the system, it's not the model. It's about another mark, right? It's like when Putin was asked, what do you think it's the formula of the West, right, meant as a success? And the guy deflected in a completely anti-traditional way on, in fact, the sclerodization of the institutional hypothesis. There is no such thing like the West, he said, even though the Russians are Westerners, but they simply don't know it, or they're too paranoid, of course, to accept it and, to actually take off the mask that everybody, especially Westerners, are able to see through and said, you see, I don't know, Britain is a monarchy, France is a republic, the United States is a federation, similar things, right? Except the West still has this compactly, superior standards, shared patrimony, and these institutional differences are not what actually make us superior. And so trying to deny this through this incredibly anti-traditional, how could you even conceive an answer like that? The generation is the hallmark of inferior cultures, of course, that cannot afford what others can. There's a lot about this. Like, for example, in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh conducted daily rituals intended to renew divine strength with him, this repetition, as we've seen, with the sun rising once again, as Ra himself, of course, made the rite effective. It wasn't the rite that made the ruler effective. It's the other way around, right? But you have been told, of course, history of religion in a materialistic way, in a communistic way, in an anti-traditional way. You do not know what that even means. It's the sovereign that makes the rite. It's not the rite that makes the sovereign. Similarly, in Persia, as noted by the later medieval scholar Firdusi, in talking about the Iranian epos in that sense, and there is a lot in there we will get to some point, but also reported equally by Xenophon in the Cyropaedia 8 verse 26 and 6 verse 17, the king was regarded as the earthly embodiment of the god of light and belonged to the caste of the Magi, serving as its leader. He was the highest priest in his civilization, the true medium of God, right? Conversely, amongst certain cultures, the tradition of deposing or even executing a leader during times of misfortune or calamity signifies a perceived decline in the mystical force of fortune. It's not a surprise that yesterday I was starting to talk about the conquistadores and the broader relation between Europeans and the pre-Columbians, dictated by the traditional meaning of fortuna that I expounded in the video about the Fortuna Kaiser, is a reference often to. If you do not take the risk, if you're not that combative, if you're not struggling all the time, in other words, if you're not gambling and you're not properly a military leader, that's why also power manifests, because this is also the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity. The military is associated with gamble. You live in a world of disgusting culturalism in which you have been told that the military is the blind hatred, the people is the primordial hatred that is channeled, is funneled by the higher spheres into something rational and intelligent. Of course, lesser people think that they are, again, ruled by terrible people, instead they're so pure and brave and capable, of course, to be ruled by that, and still surprisingly improving their conditions because of other people's accomplishments. The military is associated with the gambling, with the with the risk, right? The decision of taking a risk and acting upon that through determination, coup d'oeil. We explained this in the Funk-Reedy series. And it is this continuous trying and risking and even failing like in Caesar's event, in fact, that will make Fortuna in love with them, and which will legitimize their right to lead. There's no such thing like leadership without risk, right? And that's where you measure true leaders. Naturally, failing per se is not positive, right? But it depends on how you fail, and it depends in fact on how strong you come back. It's not that, okay, you failed, but I don't know, your enemies won, you were killed, but I still survive, I'm still better. But it doesn't really work like that in tradition. That's kind of what the losers will keep singing, because while they are in chains, actually, it's not like until they are alive, again, they can't shake those off of them. But let's say failure per se, especially in terms of power, and you can't really see any other telling the truth, is negative. It means that you were not enough, and worse, that was something in fact wrong with you, because the standard should be divine for everyone. That's normality. If our world exists, it's because there is this collective sin, and what failure means is simply reverting back to a lower level, and even if you had risen to fight whatever, you just come where you were. And you have lost something, right? You also gained something else. There's been a trade there, but this doesn't mean that the balance is positive in any way. If you have shrunk, you've actually failed badly, and that there's nothing proud of to be that, right? I say this because certain currents of traditionalism incorrectly presume that you can win also when you lose, right? There are ways of winning even when you die, for example. This is true. But we're talking about very liminal cases, and still they have to do with an actual accomplishment. They can't, in fact, just be wishful thinking. Now, the ancient communities held the belief that every misfortune mystically disqualifies a leader. This is exactly what we mean by failure is not an option. This reflects the notion that success cannot be attributed to any other cause but the relation with the divine standard. So in this sense, the idea relates, for example, to the Hvarena or Mazdean concept of glory. In the Norse world, let's say until the time of the gods, the principle of royal sanctity persisted to a degree, even though this was also very inflated in the Gothic cases by the fact that the Romans sort of made the Gothic monarchy as such, because the Germans were heavily intolerant of this. They were not particularly developed, but they had, because of this, that level of militarization that made them aware of what it meant, the difference between being having liberty, right, and being dead, and how this passed through fighting. And so the exercise of the Imperium. As we know, the king was seen as part of the Aesir, as a demigod. It is the Ansis. In Germanic, actually, like there is a very beautiful etymology of this ruler who triumphed to the strength of Fortuna, which he could potentially lose. Tacitus talks about this, for example, the Germans entrusting themselves a lot to luck, also to a superstitious degree, of course, in the lower ranks, but still revolving around this connected to the chiefs, to the war band leaders. Because the term Ansus, that is the best etymology, of course, of the Aesir, is believed to originate from the Proto-Indo-European root Hemsu, which shows a close connection to the Sanskrit word Asura, the Avestan term Aura, meaning God or Lord, and obviously being connected with the same aurum, right? The same golden in Latin, and the aura that is around the head, right? In that literally means that the guy is transfiguring divinely in the process. Also, the Hittite word Asi, which means to give birth, to beget, right? So this stresses the regeneration process that occurs in transfiguration, so that emanation of further life, right, and transcendence of the current condition, also the collective, especially the collective level. You know how the Germans, that definitely had always difficulties with their empires, interpreted a bit like in their own folk guys, let's say the existence as constantly undermined by, of course, the primordial snake eating up, right, the rotten roots of the tree of the world, right? And so that was always something like in the Germanic, the Norse sagas, the hero dies always in some sort of ignominious way because of some sin that he had committed at some point. It sort of course, changed, altered the world forever, and eventually came back in a karma style. Think about Siegfried, think about like all the Siegfried par excellence, but there are lots of other heroes also in the actual historical reality. Think about Albo, and we talk about Longbirds often, like how they die. It's always, you know, a sort of shady way, right? And so this reflected, of course, the Germanic political instability. And so the idea was that they were so habituated to see these chiefs falling and failing, right, on their part, that they would reflect more deeply on how authority is undermined in a way. You can argue that also among the Anglo-Saxons, the common law emerged in a sense in this regard. I mean, that idea of beware of tyranny is just like a, again, secularistic, modernistic, post-traditional understanding of the same, but rather the awareness that the people have power, and so they can themselves be the rulers, right? Because again, in that game we said before, yes, who is the ruler actually? Is he who holds power? But in basically everybody holds power, as we've seen, to a degree, right? The guy who sort of is elected and manages to manage as a medium, a lot of it is seen as a leader of some sort. But again, there are not just kings for that matter, and there are lots of different rulers sort of down the petty rulers down the line in the hierarchy. So there's this sort of greater flipping and greater sort of awareness in the Germanic world of the necessity of that, say, freshening with new blood, right? The regeneration of the stock. Now, for instance, tradition holds also that the ancient Iranian king Ima famously lost his glory or mystical virtue due to his failure to uphold the fundamental Aryan value of truth. This is the most famous example, right? Having sullied himself with what? With lies. The idea is that if you do not, in wisdom, describe the word correctly and you say something that is wrong, you will not achieve, right? The divine glory with her golden wings will fly away from you. And actually there are three here connected. The source is, by the way, the Yasht. The Yasht, or Yasht, are a collection of 21 hymns from the later Avesta, mainly poetic. So we are in the Iranian tradition. This is exactly Yasht 1934-35. And the Kravena, so this essentially the Imperium, the divine glory, the Holy Ghost, the soul of chivalry, the fields, etc., retracts. There are the Fravashis, by the way, then, around the same places here that are really terrifyingly beautiful, especially when possessed and transfigured. Retracting thrice. In relation, this is the Holy Trinity, of course, in relation to what? To the tripartition of the Indo-European society, the estates, priesthood, warriorhood, and the workers, we would say. This were the three dignities of the Uma, right? That is understood in the